just to remind you of where we are on the roadmap of this course. You remember I said we were looking really at four different sort of parts of this winterim. First of all, the introduction, reviewing the biblical foundations, which we did on the first day, the foundational presuppositions of expository preaching, the primary arguments for consecutive exposition, not just for expository preaching, but for consecutive exposition. We looked at that, and then we've spent the last several days really looking at the core issue of exegesis, studying the biblical text, and we laid out, my goal in this class was to give you a repeatable process for consecutive exposition. We've done that on the exegesis side, and I'll review that, Lord willing, tomorrow, I think, before we end. I'll go back through the whole process. But today we come to taking all of that study and all of that work where you have mined the details of the text, you have compared it with its context, with the larger context of Scripture. You have all of this data now that you've collected in your study, and we're coming to exposition, and that is the crafting of an expository sermon from that data that you now have collected, okay? So let's begin then to talk about this issue of exposition. Martin Lloyd-Jones preached for the last time as pastor of Westminster Chapel on Friday, March 1st, 1968. Both surgery and illness sort of forced his retirement. But a few months later, after he'd already retired, in October of 1968, after visiting a number of other churches, Lloyd-Jones spoke at a gathering of pastors about preaching. In one of the most recent books Ian Murray wrote about the doctor, he describes what Lloyd-Jones said on that occasion, the October after he had retired from preaching at Westminster, had been to some other churches and had some comments about preaching. Here's one of what he said. One quote that was said that afternoon sets the table for our discussion here this morning. Listen to Lloyd-Jones. The concern of a preacher should be to have a message, and he must labor to put it into the best form in which it can be delivered. A running commentary is not a sermon. Biblical preaching brings out a message, a mechanical explanation of the meaning of words, not fused into a message with point and power that leaves hearers glorying in God, is not preaching. So it's not merely now taking the data that you accumulated in your study and sort of dumping it on your people, or sort of tracking verse by verse in sort of a commentary style through the text. That's not expository preaching. Two words summarize everything that we do in the process of expository preaching. One of those is exegesis, the studying the text of Scripture. The other is exposition, preparing an expository message. Neglect either of those, and you really don't have expository preaching. Now, to exegete then is to draw out from a text, as I've noted for you, all the truth that is in it. To exposit is to expose, to make visible, to make known, that is to show something for what it is. That's what we do in the process of crafting an expository sermon. You read this in Toward an Exegetical Theology. Kaiser said, exegesis is never an end in itself. Its purposes are never fully realized until it begins to take into account the problems of transferring what has been learned from the text over to the waiting church. To put it more bluntly, exegesis must come to terms with the audience as well as with what the author meant by the words he used. John MacArthur puts it this way. He says, preaching an expository message involves far more than standing in the pulpit and reviewing the high points, details, and components unearthed through research. Neither a word study nor a running commentary on a passage is in itself an expository sermon. An expository sermon does more than simply explain the grammatical structure of a passage and the meaning of its words. He goes on to say, the task of the expository preacher is to take the mass of raw data from the text and bridge the gap between exegesis and exposition. Just to make this a little clearer, one author illustrates the relationship between exegesis and exposition in this way. He says, think for a moment of pearls. He says, the exegete is like the diver who brings the pearls up from the ocean floor. An expositor is like the jeweler who carefully arranges them into a necklace. It's a great comparison, a great analogy, I think. In exegesis, you are diving down and bringing up those pearls. In creating an expository message, you are carefully arranging them into a beautiful form that can be presented and can be understood. Exegesis is a science with fixed laws and methods, as we talked about, with hermeneutical principles that need to be followed. Creating an expository message from that exegesis, there are elements of science to it. We'll talk about those, but there's also a great deal of art to it. There's a skill that has to be learned and refined. I want to go a little deeper, or I want to take you deeper into each of the steps in the art of creating an expository sermon. So just as we did with exegesis, let me give you a roadmap. Here's what's required to craft an expository sermon from the raw data that you have mined. We're going to go through each of these. So let me give you a summary of the process. And by the way, one of the appendices that I will give you that you'll get as a result of being in this class will be an outline of all of this. So you can even put it in front of you if you want to on a day of study and just kind of walk your way through the process. So you'll get the summary of both sides, exegesis and exposition. But here's a summary of crafting an expository sermon. First of all, writing the proposition. That's really a first and foundational step. Secondly, structuring the message. Of course, that has to do with your outline. It's to do with the bones that support the message and the content. Then there's building the body. That's bringing all the material into that structure that's going to communicate the meaning of the passage and illustrate it and apply it. Then there's creating a logical flow. Once you have your main point, there's your proposition, and once you have your big bones, the outline of your message, and once you have informed those outline points with the content that is in each of those sections of Scripture, you're explaining the text, you're illustrating the text, you're applying the text, you're arguing for the meaning, then you need to connect those points with transition statements that let your audience know, I'm leaving point one and I'm going to point two, so that they can track with you and follow you, and there's a logical sequence so they're not lost. And then you craft an introduction and a conclusion. Both are important. Most preachers spend a whole lot of time working on an introduction and almost no time figuring what they're going to say at the end. That's a really bad practice, and we'll talk about what to do there. Formatting your notes. All right, you've now put the message together. You have an introduction, you have a conclusion, you have a proposition, you have a structure, you have content, you've built the body of that sermon. It's all there. Now, let's talk about how to structure your notes, both what you do in your study and what you take into the pulpit. And there are some scientific issues that you can use to develop that and make it work well. Things that every skilled preacher does, and then there's some art things as well. So we'll talk about both of those when it comes to your notes. And then the final step of sort of finishing up this expository sermon process is preparing your heart to preach. We don't want to neglect that, right? We don't want to do all this work and depend on ourselves to deliver it. So there is, in the end, I think a process, and I'll walk you through my own. It'll just give you some ideas to consider as you think about preparing your own heart to preach. Okay? Any questions about that, or you kind of see where we're going today and tomorrow? Okay, well then let's get started. I want to begin by making sure you understand how the specific steps of exegesis relate to the expository message, to the exposition. And there is, if you do it the way we've talked about, there is a direct correlation between the two. It's not like you do exegesis and then that's not going to help you at all in crafting your expository message. The truth is exactly the opposite. If you follow the process we've talked about, what you've done so far will make the bridge to an expository sermon easy. Well, okay, to be honest, relatively easy, okay? Much easier than if you were just saying, okay, I did all this research, and now I'm going to put a sermon together. Instead, you allow your exegesis to inform your exposition, and here's how. In exegesis, there are three basic things that you have in mind. First of all, you have the theme of the paragraph. Remember, we came up with a theme, and we've refined that theme as we've continued our study. If the preliminary theme we arrived at, as we've studied more, as we've read, as we've evaluated our own interpretation against commentaries, if we've decided, well, that needs to be tweaked a little bit, we've tweaked it. If we've decided, you know what, I was just dead wrong, and I need to rewrite it, you've already done that. You did that in the process of exegesis. You know the theme of the passage. Also, in doing the block diagram, you have the syntactical structure. You have the flow of the author's thought. And then finally, in looking up the proper nouns and in doing word studies and even in reading commentaries, etc., you have accumulated a great deal of historical and grammatical detail. That's what you've done in exegesis. So how do those things that you have accumulated in the process of your study, how do those inform your sermon? First of all, what about theme? How does the exegetical theme that you discovered in your study, how does that help you? What does it provide when it comes to your expository sermon? It provides your proposition. There ought to be, there must be, if you're going to be an expository preacher, a direct correlation between the exegetical theme of that paragraph and your proposition. Why is that? That's the main point. And if it's the author's main point, and you're going to be an expositional preacher, it's got to be your main point. So, discovering that theme in exegesis becomes foundational because it then provides you with your proposition, the main point of the sermon. The main point of your sermon becomes the main point of the passage, is the main point of the author. So you see how I'm not looking at this paragraph going, what am I going to say about this paragraph? No, I'm just saying, what did he say? What is his main point? And I'm going to make that my main point. That becomes my proposition. We'll talk about how to craft that proposition from an exegetical theme in just a minute. All right, what about syntactical structure? As you've seen the flow of the author's thought in exegesis, what does that provide us in our expositional message? Outline, absolutely. That becomes my outline. Now, why would I do that? What's better than an inspired outline? Right? What's better than following the outline the author followed? Now, are there times when your syntactical analysis doesn't immediately and easily translate over to an outline? Yes, there will be times. There will be times when you'll choose. I'll show you an example later this morning of one in Romans 1 where I didn't, I didn't exactly follow the syntactical analysis, but largely I did. And we'll talk about why. But most of the time, guys, 95% of the time, maybe more than that, this is exactly how it works. Your block diagram becomes your outline. What about your historical grammatical detail? All of that data that you collected in looking at nouns and keywords and et cetera, cross-references. What does that provide you in your sermon? The body of the message. That fills in under each outline point. So do you see that all of that work we did, that process we followed, just logically leads us to craft a message that isn't my own? You see, the beauty of this approach is I'm not doing this. Obviously, I'm doing the work here, but I'm not making this sermon. I'm letting Paul make this sermon. As much as possible, I'm letting him make the sermon. And boy, does that bring a difference in genuine authority. Because when I talk to my people now, I really am being a mouthpiece for God. This isn't my sermon. This isn't something really creative I spun off of my head. This is simply what God said in Romans. Questions about that? I want you to see this relationship before we get started because this is foundational. All right. So let's move on then to using that exegetical theme that we discovered in exegesis to writing a proposition for our sermon. Writing the proposition. Although different resources on preaching, you can read a lot of different books on preaching, they will disagree on a lot of different things. And honestly, it's hard to find one preaching resource that I can say to you wholeheartedly, oh, this is it. This is the definitive preaching resource. I think the closest I would come is the original version of John Broadus on the preparation and delivery of sermons. It's a bit dated. There's some things there. He doesn't go into block diagramming, which I think Kaiser's very helpful on. We were talking about this yesterday. Ramus Richards' book, Preparing Expository Sermons, is helpful in that area and one or two others. There's some other things in his book that I wouldn't recommend to you. But you know, block diagramming would maybe be the one major weakness I would see with John Broadus' book. But there are a lot of practical things on preaching in that book that are very helpful. It's kind of the classic. I told you the story of that, right? The story of on the preparation and delivery of sermons. Just a remarkable providence of God that we have that. But anyway, my point is, different resources on preaching will disagree on a lot of different things. But I can tell you this, all of them agree on the need for a proposition. Terminology varies. It's sometimes called the proposition, as I am here. Sometimes it's called the central idea, the big idea, the theme, the thesis, the main thought. Whatever you want to call it, every cohesive sermon has one. But sadly, very few preachers take the time to craft a proposition. Now, why is a proposition important? Charles Simeon, describing the proposition, said this. This is quoted in Stott's Between Two Worlds. He says, every sermon should have, like a telescope, but one object in its field. He continued to explain how a preacher should determine what that one object should be. Listen to this. As soon as the text is chosen, the first inquiry is, what is the principal scope and meaning of the text? In other words, what's its theme? That's where we've been. I beg every young minister especially to remember this. And then he goes on to say that once you've discovered the text principal meaning, the next step is to express it, quote, in a categorical proposition. This is the great secret of all composition for the pulpit, end quote. In a separate article, Simeon emphasizes the practical importance of a proposition. You know, why is this important? Listen to this. He says, reduce your text to a simple proposition and lay that down as the warp. And then make use of the text itself as the woof. You know those two words from making materials and making fabric. Illustrating the main idea by the various terms in which it's contained. Screw the word into the minds of your hearers. A screw is the strongest of all mechanical powers. When it has turned a few times, scarcely any power can pull it out. That's really what a proposition does, is it screws the truth into the mind of your hearer, the truth of that paragraph into the minds of your hearers. The biblical text, I know you're tired of hearing me say this, but the biblical text has only one unchangeable meaning determined by the intent of the author. There can be a lot of implications, a lot of applications, but only one meaning or overriding thrust. As Kaiser calls it, the single truth intention. Our job as preachers is to find the biblical author's central theme, understand how he develops that theme, and then make his theme and his development of that theme central to our message. So the proposition is the most essential feature in the organization of the sermon. Let me say that again. The proposition is the most essential feature to the organization of the sermon. It serves as the foundation on which the entire sermon is built. So, what exactly is a proposition? John Broadus says, whether a sermon has 2 points or 10 points, it must have 1 point. It must be about something. The proposition identifies that 1 point. It is the sermon reduced to 1 sentence. I would even say it differently. It is the exegetical theme of the passage put into the form of a timeless truth. The exegetical theme of the passage put into the form of a timeless truth and then stated in 1 sentence. It should be as concise as possible without sacrificing clarity. One textbook on preaching, and I don't necessarily buy this, I don't believe in artificial constraints on this, but Vine and Shattuck often actually say that you should, for the sake of conciseness, have it no longer than 15 to 18 words. It should be pointed, direct, concise. I agree with the conciseness. I don't think you need to count the number of words, but you get the point. You get the point. The purpose of the proposition is to declare in a clear-cut statement the exact objective of the sermon. Now, let's take this proposition apart. Since this is so important, let's make sure we understand it. I'm going to give you the components, and then stick with me if you're going, I'm not with him yet. I'm going to give you several examples. So I hope by the time we're done, you'll get the picture of this, what this is. The necessary components of a proposition. Technically and formally, we're talking about a package of 3 elements. First of all, a concise statement of the timeless truth of the passage contained in the preaching text. In the exegetical process, you have already identified the central idea of the text, and you've already written it. You've written it down in your notes, hopefully in a concise 1-sentence summary. Secondly, in this package, in addition to the concise statement of the timeless truth of the passage, there's what can be called an interrogative. Again, stay with me. And then the third part of the propositional package is a transitional sentence. So the proposition isn't technically just 1 sentence, it's a package. And in the package, there's a concise statement of the timeless truth of the passage, there's an interrogative, and there's a transitional sentence which links the proposition and the main points. Usually includes a key word, a plural noun. Now, let's walk through an example of this so you begin to get a feel for it. Let's take 2 Timothy 2:2. This is, as I say, they're adapted from Vine and Shattuck, so I think they do a good job of showing how this package comes together. 2 Timothy 2:2, the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, Entrust these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Now, what is potentially an exegetical theme from that passage? In other words, tell me what that's teaching in a sentence. Okay, here's a way to say it. I'm not going to give you time to do it, so I'll just tell you, all right? We're going to keep moving here. The exegetical theme would be something like this. Paul charged Timothy to faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation. You see that? That is simply that sentence put in a thematic form. This is what this passage is about. Okay? You probably would have landed somewhere near that if you were writing an exegetical theme. You're doing your research, you're looking at, okay, what is this about? So what you need to do in taking the exegetical theme and converting it to a proposition is you need to, first of all, identify and change those elements that need to be made timeless. Remember, the proposition for your sermon needs to be timeless and not tied to individuals for the most part. So, past tense verbs, proper names except for God's name, dated terminology, specific circumstances, cultural issues. You're trying to make the exegetical theme now, timeless. So look at that exegetical theme and tell me what elements in there are not timeless. Paul, Timothy, primarily that's it, right? Okay, if we had said, no, there's one more. What's the other one? Charge, past tense. That's what happened in the first century. I'm trying to make it timeless. So if I change those dated parts of my exegetical theme, all I'm doing now is I'm keeping the exegetical theme. I'm just converting it to a timeless truth. So, Paul, what would be a potential replacement for Paul? What position was Paul in? He was a leader. He was a spiritual leader to Timothy. Certainly he was an apostle, but it goes beyond being an apostle. He's charging Timothy to do this too. And Paul is urging Timothy, and what role is Timothy in? Yeah, he's an episkopos. He's in the church in Ephesus. He's pastoring. So the Apostle Paul, the sort of ultimate spiritual mentor, charged a pastor to faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation. You see how I'm working at making my exegetical theme timeless. So we'd end up with something like this. The timeless truth, this becomes my proposition. The timeless truth of my proposition. Christian leaders, I could say pastors, okay, that would be legitimate. Christian leaders must faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation. Notice I took out the past tense verb. It's all present tense. It's the truth of that paragraph, that verse, timelessly presented. That becomes my proposition. Christian leaders, or as I said, pastors, elders, must faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation. If I'm preaching to pastors, I maybe make that word pastors because that's my audience. But if I'm preaching to my church, I maybe make it Christian leaders. Why? Because while the direct authorial intent is that pastors do this, that elders do this, are other people responsible to do this as well? Yeah, absolutely. And so all of the people in my church who have any spiritual leadership whatsoever bear this responsibility by implication. So you see how maybe your proposition changes slightly even based on your audience. And that's still legitimate because you're still capturing the meaning of this passage in this timeless truth. Any questions about that? All right. So that's the timeless truth. That's followed by an interrogative. An interrogative, by that I mean it is usually one of 5 adverbs that connect the proposition to the main points of the sermon. Answering the question, why? Why should Christian leaders faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation? Or, how? How do pastors pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation? Or what? What are we to pass to the next generation? Or when? Or where? Those are the interrogatives. So, for example, the concise statement, Christian leaders must faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation. There's the timeless truth. Here's my interrogative. But how do we accomplish that task? You see what I'm doing? I am now taking that timeless truth of the passage and I'm leading them with that interrogative to what Paul says about that in the passage. How do we accomplish that task? The third part of the propositional package, you have the timeless truth, you have the interrogative. The third part of that propositional package is the transitional sentence. Paul identifies the key principles involved in building a ministry to last are creating a legacy of faithful men. Okay? Now, let's look at that. You see why that's a transitional statement. It is not the truth, the timeless truth of the passage, right? It's something beyond that, but it's now providing a roadmap for my listeners to show them what Paul does with that timeless truth in that passage. Braga says, let's see if I have this here. Let me go one step further. No, I don't have it. Okay. Braga in his book says this sentence ties the proposition and the main points of the sermon together and provides a smooth passage from the proposition to the main divisions. In other words, this transitional sentence shows how the sermon, and therefore how the passage, developed that timeless truth. Again, I'm going to give you several examples, so stay with me. I think it'll become clear. Now, when I taught this passage, this was my transition, and this was the timeless truth. This was my interrogative. This was my transition. Paul identifies, so read it as a package. The one on the right-hand side there, this was in my sermon. Christian leaders, this text teaches us that Christian leaders must faithfully pass the treasure of sound doctrine to the next generation. But how do we accomplish that? Well, Paul in this text identifies the key principles involved in building a ministry to last or creating a legacy of faithful men. Now notice, what am I telling them the rest of my sermon is going to be about? The principles for how to accomplish this task. Because that's what I see in this text. That's what Paul is developing in this text. He's giving us those foundational principles involved in Christian leaders passing on sound doctrine to the next generation. So, when I did a block diagram on this text, I ended up with 4 outline points. First of all, here are the principles. Employ the right method. Entrust, I developed that idea. Impart the right content. The things that you have heard from me, and the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses. Pick the right men, faithful men who will be able to teach others also, and pursue the right goals. When you're done with them, they will be able to teach others also. That implies what? That implies that they understand the Scripture. It implies that they're qualified to teach. It implies that they are gifted, that they're skilled to teach. They have the necessary skills to communicate the truth. So you see how all of this hangs together as a package. And it all came out of my exegesis. The timeless truth was simply the timeless, the exegetical theme converted into a timeless truth. You see that. The interrogative simply showed how Paul developed this in this passage. And then my transition sentence said, here's how Paul develops it. He gives us these principles. Now notice I highlighted the word principles. That is a very important word. In every transition sentence in your sermon, there should be a key noun, a key plural noun. Why? Because that identifies what your outline points are. What are those things? Well, in this case, employ the right method, impart the right content, pick the right men, pursue the right goals. Those are principles of building faithful men, okay? Of passing on this truth to the next generation. I could have used a different word. Can you think of maybe a different word instead of principles?
Key ways.
What's that?
Key ways.
Ways would work. Guidelines. Yeah, so what I want you to see is it's not that word is like sacrosanct. You have to choose the word principles. What I want you to see is that word identifies how the passage itself develops. Ways, principles, etc. Do you see now how it all ties together? The exegetical theme becomes your proposition, your timeless, the timeless truth of your proposition. Your interrogative helps your listeners see how you're going to develop that, how you believe the writer developed that. And then your transition statement gives them a roadmap. It says, what this passage does in developing that theme is it lays out principles or ways or guidelines. Now, why is that helpful for your listeners? Why is it helpful to have that key plural noun? They're not going to get lost, because what you're going to do in your transition between each main point is you're going to bring that word back up. So they know he's leaving principle number 1 and he's going to principle number 2. Not that you say it that way every time, but they're going to get the idea. You've given them a roadmap of the passage. You're going to follow that roadmap, and the likelihood of their getting lost along the way is pretty slim. It also becomes an amazing check for the cohesiveness and the coherence of the message, because you can ask yourself, are all of those outline points principles involved in building a ministry to last? And if they aren't, I've messed up. I got to go back and check this out, look at it again. But I didn't make this up. This is flowing right out of my syntactical analysis. These outline points, we're going to talk about that in a minute, flow out of the syntactical analysis, but my proposition grew out of my exegetical theme. Yes, sir.
Clearly, Paul is giving you asked the right question, the how interrogative, right? Mm-hmm. But there's obviously other interrogative questions that we can ask from this passage. Mm-hmm. Paul answers the how, but when do we ask the other interrogative questions, like what is this sound doctrine? Because obviously, entrust these to faithful men. So would you, when you preach the entrust these to faithful men, do you kind of create subcategories and other interrogatives?
Of course, yeah. Under a given point, there may be a different interrogative. The interrogative here has to do with the intent and flow of this whole verse, this whole passage. In this case, it's not one of those. The main thrust here is not what. That's included, but it's not what. I mean, it's bigger than that. So I'm not creating that. I'm asking myself, what question is Paul really answering here about, Christian leaders passing on the truth? Well, I mean, it's bigger than what, but he alludes to what, but only sort of in passing in the things which you have heard from me. But he also says entrust. You study that word, it's a very interesting word. It's often used in the New Testament for putting food before someone. And so it then comes to have this idea of teaching. So there's a treasure aspect to it. He uses that in 1 Timothy. So it's a really rich word. And so it's bigger than what. There's a how here a good bit as well. To whom, and what your goal is. I mean, it's bigger. You see what I'm saying?
You wouldn't launch a sermon off of that question because it's not the main point, right?
Exactly.
And you could totally get sidetracked by asking another question.
That's right.
The main proposition.
Your question, your interrogative has to be based on the main flow of the passage. What is Paul really doing in this passage with that timeless truth? Okay? Yeah, absolutely. Your proposition. Now, you could preach a couple of messages from this, and you could answer another one of those questions under one of your main points. What is the right method? Or what is the right content? Or who are the right men? How do you identify the right men? So under each point, you could kind of develop that a little bit with it, but that is not an interrogative in this sense. I'm talking about the interrogative that shows where the passage went and where I'm going, therefore. Again, I'm going to give you some other examples, so I think with a few more, this will become clear. Do you see the big picture, though? The key word, that key plural noun, describes the contents of the sermon's main point. It's always a plural noun. Why? Because you always have more than one main point. Probably. Almost always. You have more than one main point, more than one outline point. Therefore, it's going to be plural, and it's going to describe what those outline points are about. All right, so a good test of the structural unity of the message is to see if the same key word can be applied to each of the main divisions. Let's just do that, okay? Employ the right method. Is that a principle of passing on the truth to the next generation? Yeah. Impart the right content. Is that a principle of how to pass on the truth to the next generation? Yes. Is picking the right men one of the principles in passing on the truth to the next generation? Yes. Is pursuing the right goal, the ultimate goal of what you produce in this, a principle? Absolutely. So now I know there's a cohesion in my message. You see how it hangs together. There's no confusion here for me. There's no confusion here for my people. And it's all flowing out of my exegesis of the text. Okay, let's move on so you can see some other examples. Although technically, by the way, let me just say, I'm going to attach to the appendices that I'm going to give you a list of plural nouns. It's not exhaustive, it's just representative. It's like 3 or 4 pages of plural nouns to show you that there are words that can help you identify what the writer's saying in that section. But let's move on to some additional examples. A couple years ago, I taught here at Shepherd's Conference a message on 1 Corinthians 3, 9 to 17, where Paul says, be careful how you build, and he develops that. My timeless truth from that passage was really easy because it's one of those paragraphs where Paul gives us the timeless truth in his own words. Be careful how you build. That was my timeless truth. Be careful how you build. What was my interrogative? Well, in this case, I tweaked it. I put the interrogative in a statement form, which you can do, okay? So I said this, and I delivered it just this way. Paul says, be careful how you build. But Paul does more here than give us a warning. He tells us how to build. See, there's my interrogative. In this passage, and why am I saying that? Why am I saying Paul tells us here how to build? Because that's what I believe he's done in this text. I'm not making that up. That comes out of my study of the passage. And then the transitional sentence, he gives us 3 foundational instructions for how to build a church. All right, you see now where's the key plural noun? Instructions. That means every one of my outline points is going to be what? An instruction for how to build a church. Did I create that? No, I captured that from my syntactical analysis. So based on the syntactical analysis, I said, the first instruction for how to build a church is build on the right foundation. The second instruction for how to build a church is use the right materials. The third instruction for how to build a church is remember the rightful owner. It's not yours. The Lord's going to deal with those who destroy his temple, his work, as it's called there. Let me give you another example. I preached 2 messages. In fact, I did this here at Grace before I left, years ago now. I preached 2 messages on Romans 5, 1 to 11. You know, where Paul says, therefore, having been justified, we have, and then he develops that through those 11 verses. These were my outline points. Let me give you my outline points, and then you help me decide what our plural noun should be. What's the plural noun that describes how Paul develops this passage? We have peace with God. We stand in God's grace. We hope in God's glory. We rejoice in our tribulations. We are confident of God's love. We will be saved from God's wrath, and we glory in God's person. Therefore, having been justified, those things are true. What did you call those? Truths, maybe responses, although they're not really my response, not all of them. We have peace with God. That's not really my response. That's good. There are a couple of them that could go there, but what's benefits? That's exactly what I call them. The benefits of our justification. That's what Paul's doing again. I'm not making that up. Clearly, he's saying, therefore, having been justified, we have, and he goes through this list of things we have. So I call them benefits. Guys, let me tell you, please don't wimp out week after week and use the plural. Most people use a plural noun. You use a plural noun, but most guys wimp out and use what? Things. Don't use the word things. Get rid of the word things. Work for exactness. What is the author saying in that passage? I could have said, here are, I forgot how many there were of those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here are 7 things that result from our justification. That's not helpful. Work for exactness. Here are 7 benefits that Paul tells us that grow out of our justification. Okay? Yes. Wait a minute, I'm sorry, you were up first. Go ahead.
Once upon a time, Dr. Cragen had given us, he said, what things are you talking about?
Yes, exactly.
Don't use that, it's too vague. But he gave us a sheet. I lost it.
You're going to get one from me that's going to be in the appendices. You're going to get, they'll be available to all of you guys after class is over tomorrow. Okay? Now, I'll show you. I'll back out here and show you what I'm talking about. Let's see. Appendices. Here we go. This is what I'm going to give you. Okay? Examples of plural nouns for the proposition. Okay? There you go. Is that all inclusive? No. But it'll at least give you some examples of how much variety you can use in deciding what the author is doing in that text. All right? But the key thing I want you to get, guys, is erase the word things from your vocabulary when it comes to describing what the author's doing in that text. It doesn't exist. You don't even know the word things. You've never heard it. You can't use it because it doesn't help. It doesn't tell your people anything about the passage. Instead, work for exactness. What are those things? Yes, sir.
How do you prevent from becoming repetitive? So say in a month you have 4 sermons you preached, and every week is 5 this, 10 this, 3 these. How do you, by the end of the month, you're going to be like, man, I have a list of top, and that's only 1 month. You know, how do you vary that?
Yeah, I think what you have to realize is there are 2 ways to vary it. First of all, you vary with the text. If you follow the text, you're varying with the text, and so you're getting as much variety as the Holy Spirit's given. Secondly, you can do some of that yourself. For example, if you don't work hard at this transitional sentence, the plural noun, you can find a lot of times to use the word ways. But if you work hard, you can be more specific, more exact. And so you can provide that. Secondly, I don't always tell them how many. Okay? Sometimes I do, but not always. The more there are, the less likely I am to tell them how many. Because I don't want them to, get scared and think, oh boy, how are we going to work through that? They know me, and they're sitting there thinking, he said there's 7 of these benefits. There's no way he's getting through this today. How many weeks is it going to take him? And they've lost me, you know what I'm saying? And so you don't always have to tell them how many. You're just using that plural noun to help them see the roadmap of how this passage unfolds. Here's the timeless truth, and here's the word that describes how Paul develops that, or your author develops that. Okay? Oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute. Before you answer that, there's one other thing you can do for variety. We're going to get there, and that is, while the syntactical analysis doesn't change, the way you create your outline, the form in which you put your outline can vary, and you do want to vary that, and I'll show you that when we get there.
The passages that you're using for these examples, are those the paragraphs that you've identified in your syntactical diagram, or are those smaller passages within the paragraph?
Yeah, the first one was a smaller passage within the larger body. This one is a paragraph, okay? And this is how I would ordinarily do it. The first one I adapted from a message, actually a Shepherd's Conference message I did in a seminar, not in the main session, many years ago now, from 2 Timothy 2:2. I was only doing that verse, and I noticed that Vine and Shaddix developed that same concept in there, so it was a nice marriage for me, so I just chose it. But this one is a paragraph, and the others, like Romans 5, 1-11, that's a paragraph.
Point of that proposition in the paragraph, or is that for just your own knowledge when you're preaching?
No, I'm always connecting them back to the theme of the passage. That proposition, let's take Romans 5, 1-11. It takes me, I did that in 2 messages then. When I preach through it this next time, it might be a little longer than that. But I'm always, every one of those messages, I'm connecting them back to the theme of that paragraph. Because I want them to see that while I may be taking a little longer to work through it, it's still the same paragraph, still the same theme. Paul's still developing the same basic content. So every message, I'm tying them back to the theme of that paragraph. Because I want them to see the context just as I have. Yeah.
When you split a paragraph like Romans 5, 1-11 up like that, are you creating a new proposition for each message, or are you constantly tying back to the one to the paragraph?
Always, again, remember what we're doing. We're taking the exegetical theme for that paragraph, and we're converting it to our timeless truth. So that never changes as long as I'm in that paragraph. Now, as someone asked, if I'm developing one of these points under that, I might write like a sub-proposition for how that relates back to the bigger one. I'm not going to do it in a way that confuses people. I'm only going to do it if it's clear, where they can track with me. But you know what I'm saying? There may be a sort of sub-main point under that main point that I want them to get, but I'm always going to tie it back to, this is what this paragraph's about. This is what this paragraph's about. Because that is what the paragraph's about. I want them to lose that. I don't want to lose that. Yeah.
Is there a legitimacy to using the exegetical outline as sometimes especially like a narrative, as the points or headings for your expository sermon.
Yeah, I get where you're going. Do you ever sort of make past tense verbs and individual proper nouns, Paul or Jesus or Bartimaeus or whatever, part of your outline point? I would never say never, okay? I would say that's not ordinarily a good practice. I think most of the time you want both your timeless truth to be timeless truth, your proposition to be a timeless truth, not tied to individual people, because you want it to apply. Part of the sermon is taking that ancient world and bridging the gap to your listener. So I think the more both your propositional package, but particularly the timeless truth, and the outline points can relate to your listeners from the meaning of that passage, the better. So make them as timeless as possible. Okay? Any other questions here? Yes, sir.
Related to that, do you have an example of how you do this process with a gospel narrative?
Let me see if I have one. You know what? I will touch on one when we get to outlines. So ask me that question again when we get there. But it works the same way. It works exactly the same way. All right. So let me move to another example. This one is another text when I preach through James 1, 13 to 18. We're going to come to Romans, by the way, so don't think I'm ignoring Romans. I'm just trying to give you, kind of a full orb view here. James 1, 13 to 18. The timeless truth was this. This is the exegetical theme of the passage, reduced to a timeless truth. Temptation is a universal human experience. We will be tempted as long as we live. The interrogative was, how should we respond when we find ourselves facing temptation? I really believe that's what James is teaching there, is you got to understand this. So the transitional sentence was, James outlines 4 godly responses to temptation. Now again, I may say 4, I may not say 4. There are 4, and I'm just so you know where I'm going. But you might just say, James outlines several godly responses here to temptation. But what's my plural noun? Key plural noun is what? Responses. What does that mean? Every outline point is going to be a response to temptation. You see how it all interrelates and connects? And the reason that's true is because I've just taken from my syntactical analysis and I've converted those to outline points, which we're going to talk about shortly. So here's what I landed with. Here are godly responses to temptation. Accept the responsibility. Identify the source. Every man is tempted and carried away by his own lust. Understand the process. James lays out this process. First comes the bait that you reach out for, and then that gives birth to sin. And the first lust, and then it gives birth to sin. The sin gives birth to a destructive habit, and it ultimately leads to character and destruction. And then he ends that section with a fascinating thing. He says, do not be deceived. For every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow of turning. What's the only deceit in that passage? The deceit of temptation. The lie that thing you want is good. And so he turns immediately and says, no, you need to see the reality. That thing isn't good. The thing you want isn't good. So turn that instead into gratitude for God, who gives us every good thing. Whatever it is your flesh is craving isn't good. It isn't going to satisfy. So unmask the deception. See it for what it is. If it's something good, it comes from God. Yes?
Like you're saying, the art comes in, the subjectivity, but could you see even maybe where accept is one response, unmask is a second, and identify and understand are 2 helps so that you accept the responsibility, so you've got 2 instead of 4?
Again, there is some element of art in this where you might make a different decision. I am trying to do 2 things in this. One, I'm trying to capture what I think are the main points from my syntactical analysis. And 2, I'm trying to follow the flow of the passage as much as possible. So that's what led me to those 4 outline points. I felt like James was making 4 different points. So I have 4 points, and he was making them in this order. And so I followed his order, okay? But that's not to say that you doing the same thing might not come up with something slightly different, or even change, as we'll talk about in a moment, the kind of outline it is. But you're still going to have to cover these issues because they're there in the text.
Third coming under, that first statement. There were 4 separate statements. Is that
Yeah, I see what you're saying. No, you're saying number 2 could have been under accept the responsibility. Is that what you're saying?
When you get to the outline, it'll be helpful for me to more visually see what did you see syntactically, and then how did that translate?
Yeah, and I don't, I'm not gonna take you right now back to James to do that. But when I did it, that's what I saw. But yeah, I think it would be legitimate to say, okay, when he says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted; he does not tempt any man. Each man is drawn away by his own lust and enticed." You could say that together, those things are saying, you need to accept the responsibility. This comes from your heart. But I think that second line, that next verse, is making a really key point that's not it's not a sub-point to don't say God made you do it. I think it's a separate point, which is saying, let me explain to you where that really is coming from. It's not God. So again, that is a judgment call. But as I looked at the flow of the text, it seemed like he was making two equally important points as opposed to one being a sub-point of the other. Yeah. Okay? Let's look at some Romans examples. Turn to Romans 1. I have here on my iPad all my 260 pages of notes from my sermons on Romans. And I've identified sort of this propositional package in each paragraph. While there are 27 sermons, how many paragraphs did we identify in Romans 1? You have 1 to 7. You have 8 to 15. You have 16 and 17. You have 18 to 23 and 24 to 32. So how many propositional packages, as you preach through Romans 1, are you going to have? Just that many. Because remember, the proposition is the exegetical theme of the paragraph. So even if you preach 27 sermons, you're only going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 propositional packages.